realize until 2 years later, it was really October, this time of year, 1781, that it ended, at least de facto, if not de rigueur. So it was a time of year to celebrate. Indeed, sir, I agree with you there. But I haven't come here to talk about war. I understand that many of you are involved in real estate, maybe all of you. I dabbled in real estate a little bit myself, during my presidency especially. You may have guessed a little bit. You referred to it as the Louisiana Purchase. It wasn't a bad deal. I think even by your lofty standards, I doubled the size of the United States of America. Depending on how you calculate it, the southern border was a little bit vague, but it was less than 4 cents an acre.
Wow.
Not bad, especially once you realize what was in it. The problem was we didn't know what was in it. That's part I want to talk about with you for the next few moments while we have some time together. We did not know what was in that territory. To give you an idea of how little we knew, when I sent Lewis and Clark out, I sent Meriwether Lewis here first to Philadelphia to receive his education in astronomy and medicine, in botany and zoology, in maps, before he left to the West. We knew so little of the West that the best map makers, the best maps extant, the best scientists, believed that the western mountains, which you call the Rocky Mountains, were about the same altitude as the Appalachian Mountains, roughly. When we sent Lewis and Clark there, my venture then, first I'll say, my purchase of that land was a risk. They had no idea what was in it. We thought that fertile land was designated by how many trees were on it. That was our barometer, our bellwether, whatever you might want to call it. So when land was discovered in the West with all those plains with just grass, people called it a desert. They thought I had failed with that risk I had taken. People criticized me because I had taken this leap, put us more into debt when we were trying to get out of debt, and I took this leap into the unknown. When I sent Lewis and Clark out, Zebulon Pike to the west, to the southwest rather, they might as well have been going to the moon. The maps went as far west as what you would call Bismarck, North Dakota, and then between there and about 100 miles westward, about 100 miles inland along the Columbia River, there was nothing. It was a blank map. And when I sent Lewis and Clark out, I knew that there was going to be a year and a half or more where we would have no communication at all. And this is actually what I'm starting to get to with what I wanted to address today. I wanted to make a point that might actually be helpful to you, and not just tell you about historical notes that might cause you to say, oh, fancy that. Did not know that before, and then you forget it 10 minutes later. Just like the children of some of you who are still in school, and when they leave on their summer vacations, yes. Hope something I say will be useful, and I'm getting to that with this story of Lewis and Clark. They were not able to check with me day by day, especially after they left the winter camp in the spring of 1805 for the Mandan Indian camps, again, when I mentioned Bismarck, North Dakota in your day. A year and a half passed, nothing, no communications at all. Captains Lewis and Clark had to make every decision with the fate of our nation on their shoulders. The risk not just of those men, but they were the first white men a number of those Indian tribes ever saw. York, I have to bring up awkward subjects too, it's my job to be honest with the good and the bad. York was Clark's slave, his African slave. A number of these Indian tribes had never seen anyone of African descent. So at the Mandan villages, when Big White, and Shahike, two of the chiefs of the Mandan and Hidatsa villages there, saw York, they thought that he had his skin covered with charcoal, because that's what the Mandan and Hidatsas did to their bravest warriors. So they would cover their skin in charcoal as going out to battle to indicate that was the bravest one among them. They thought York was the leader of the expedition. Awesome. And Shahike tried to rub the charcoal off of York's face because he could not believe that the Great Spirit had blessed a man so much to permanently mark him with bravery and such. So they didn't know anything about us. We knew nothing about them. And when the men moved along the Missouri River, as they got closer to what you call the Rocky Mountains, and they saw in the middle of July snow on the top of them, they began to realize maybe they're a little bigger than they thought. Maybe they'd bitten off more than they could chew. The unknown into which they were venturing so bravely was much greater than they even imagined. I understand that many of you have come here, all of you have come here today, not only to celebrate your successes, but to prepare yourselves for your own ability to travel into the unknown of what lies ahead of you in the future. You celebrate because you have succeeded and you justly deserve to. But then you also know you must prepare yourselves for the new challenges. To this, I will tell you of a moment on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Part of their expedition's mission was to find the source of the Missouri River. They did that in the Rocky Mountains. One of the men in the expedition stood astride the stream and declared that he felt blessed, that he had finally lived to see the day he could stand with one foot on either side of the mighty Missouri River. They celebrated that day, but then they got to the top of that first range of the mountains. They thought, according to the best science of the day, all of what I've been able to tell them, all of what previous explorers have been able to tell them, that what they'd see on the top of that mountain was a fertile plain. The Columbia River on the other side, leading off to the western coast, maybe a 3 or 4 day portage carrying their supplies over the mountain, and then they would have found the Northwest Passage, giving the United States an economic shortcut to the Orient, which would have made us within a generation the economic power of the world. This was our chance. And Meriwether Lewis wrote of this moment when he finally climbed up those last few hundred feet to the top of that first range that he thought was the only range. And what he saw on the other side was snow-capped peak after snow-capped peak. Mountain after mountain, as far as his eyes could see. And he knew in a moment that the dreams of centuries of a Northwest Passage were over. He knew in a moment that in succeeding in part of his mission, the success that they had achieved, finding the source of the Missouri River, had opened their eyes to the inevitable failure of another part of their mission, of their goal, because the Northwest Passage didn't exist. Now, at this moment, you might think, you might become melancholic. That's the term we used. You might say depressed. Meriwether Lewis had a tendency to that. He did not, though. He wrote in his journal that night, mentioned nothing of chagrin, nothing of disappointment. He simply mentioned the fact of what these new mountains were. And then he specified he knew they had to now cross them. And you all face that yourselves. The more success you achieve, the more you'll find yourselves in Meriwether Lewis's shoes, or moccasins as it were on that day. Because when you set yourself out on a goal, and you achieve it, congratulations, you achieve your goal, you climb to that peak. But from that peak, yes, you celebrate those achievements, take time for that. What you will often see are other mountain peaks that you have to climb that you could not have known of before the success you've just achieved. The man who's small in spirit, the woman who is trepidatious, might come to that moment and think of failure only and be discouraged. But take Meriwether Lewis and William Clark's example here. They saw those new challenges, but all they did was say, well, now this is the reality. Now we have those mountains to climb. So congratulations on your success. It has enabled you to find a new challenge. Having found this, they could have turned around when they realized that the mission was over. Find the Northwest Passage that doesn't exist. Find the source of the Missouri, they've done it. But this man's wearing a chemise here, and he didn't need permission to call him back in. And we talked a little bit about it. The terminology on the front of it doesn't match the terminology of my day. But I've been able to gather what it means. Think like a CEO. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in that moment had to think like the President of the United States. I was their CEO. But they could not turn to me and ask for permission every moment, nor what I wanted them to do. The reason why I appointed them was because I knew they were capable of that. They had already proved themselves capable of thinking in the big picture, even when the picture right in front of them was bigger than even those who were seemingly in command of the big picture ever could have dreamed. The short story is, they almost died crossing those mountains, but they crossed them. They had to eat candles at one point. They had to kill a colt to eat it, but they made it across, all the way to the Pacific and back. Only lost one man on the entire expedition. In that expedition, they laid claim to the United States, to the Western Territory. They were the first Americans, the first white men to establish diplomatic communication with countless Indian tribes. They mapped out the West. They found fur resources, economic resources of beaver pelts, of gold and silver that we would be able to use later. And they opened doors we didn't know existed. And they did this because when they reached that success and that moment of triumph, when the moment of triumph revealed to them what could have been taken as a moment of failure, mountains as far as the eye can see from atop the mountain you thought was the only mountain, and instead they took that as an opportunity for more successes. As a result, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark are celebrated justly for centuries as examples of great leadership. And I celebrate them today, not bragging about my own ability. I didn't go with them. But I am proud that I chose them. And each one of you, in celebrating your victories, but preparing yourself for a year to come as you contemplate setting out on new adventures and climbing new mountains, might benefit yourselves a little bit if you look back on Lewis and Clark and their example. When next you find yourself standing atop a mountain and looking out and realizing you've just discovered innumerable obstacles that you didn't know exist beforehand, remember Lewis and Clark, and remember they're only obstacles to the pessimist. To the optimist, they're new opportunities. With that, I would like to raise a toast, my friends, those of you who are holding glasses, if anybody is. And if anyone, just raise your hand. It is polite, if without a glass in your hand, to raise your right hand to the side, not to the front, please, but don't confuse you. And there's an expression that William Clark used throughout the journals. It was this: proceed on. Every time we reached a new obstacle, he would say, then we proceeded on. It became like a song. May you then, my friends, whatever obstacles you find, remember the example of Lewis and Clark, that they are just opportunities in disguise. And to Lewis and Clark and to you, may we all proceed on. My friends. Woo!